Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure today to be talking with Matt Johnson, author of the crime novels Wicked Game, Deadly Game, and Endgame. Hello, Matt. How are you?
Good morning, Matthew. It's a pleasure to join you.
Fantastic. You've had great success with your writing so far, but your journey into becoming an author has been a very personal one. Can you tell us how you came to be where you are today?
Yeah, it's a long story, and I apologise in advance for it. But I came to writing through a very convoluted way, and with no intention of becoming a writer. It was very much a case of me being an accidental author. As a child, I was a very keen reader. I used to go to the library where I lived in Harrow in northwest London. Rayners Lane was our local library, and I used to go there on my way home from school. And I can remember walking home along the local dual carriageway from the library to my home, clutching my latest choices, mostly science fiction in those days, and being excited, absolutely adrenalized at the prospect of when I got home, I was going to be able to launch into one of these stories. I used to read the likes of Isaac Asimov, people like that, and James Herbert, who wrote The Rats, The Fog, and those were sort of and I used to get like comics every Friday. My father used to come home from the office and bring comics like The Wizard and things like that. But I loved the books that had stories in them, as opposed to just cartoons. Look and Learn was another favourite. They had real stories in them. But as I grew through my teens, and first of all, I went in the army, and then I went in the police service. Inevitably, working demands were such that I started to lose the time to be able to read. So I became a once a year latest Jack Reacher type reader, on holiday and read it. So that was me. No plans, no aspirations. All the writing I ever did was essentially writing police reports and that kind of thing for one thing or another. Fast forward to, should we start 1982, probably starts the setting for the sequence of events that eventually resulted in me becoming a writer. 1982, I was working in plainclothes in North London in an area called Camden. I was working as an aide to CID, and I was working on a car called a Q car. A Q car was a plainclothes emergency response car that would respond to things like pickpockets operating an area where a uniformed car couldn't go along because they'd just be scared away and there'd never be any chance of catching them. So we had been sent to Camden Town tube station, where there were some dippers and pickpockets that were believed to be operating. And London was really quiet that day. And the reason it was really quiet was because that morning, the Hyde Park bomb had gone off. And so many of the people that were in traffic, a lot of the tubes had shut down, a lot of the traffic had been dispersed. And so the area in which we were was relatively quiet. We found these two suspected pickpockets, and we stopped them and were just starting to question them when we heard a whoomp in the background, and it sounded afterwards like the sound of scaffolding crashing down. Incredible sound. And now I'll be honest, I don't think if the Hyde Park bomb hadn't gone off that morning, we would have known what it was, because I'd never heard anything of that scale before, certainly. I don't think my colleagues had. But we knew what it was straight away because of the bomb that had gone off that morning. And it was the Regent's Park bomb. We climbed back into the police car, said goodbye to the two suspects, went to go on the radio to report what we'd heard. But of course, we were way behind. Loads of others had heard it. People much closer to the scene were aware of what was going on. Eventually, as the confusion settled down, we were sent to Regent's Park. I went to the Regent's Park Bandstand, scene of devastation, lots of injured casualties. 6 or 7 soldiers from the Royal Green Jackets had been killed, who were the bandsmen who were performing on the bandstand. Absolutely awful. Fast forward to 1984. I'm still a PC, but I'm back in uniform by this time, driving a police traffic car. 17th of April, 1984, a date that's ingrained on my memory, because I was sent to do an ambulance escort to Charles II Street, just off of Regent Street in central London. And Charles II Street is a street that runs off St James's Square, where the Libyan People's Bureau was situated. And what had happened that morning is WPC Yvonne Fletcher had been shot, and I was sent to escort the ambulance in which she was being carried to the Westminster Hospital to get her there as quickly as possible. Now, Yvonne Fletcher was a friend of mine. She was a close friend of my first wife, and I'd been at my housewarming party with her fiance just a few weeks before that day. I didn't know she was in the hospital. Sorry, that she was in the ambulance. I only found out that evening when the news came on. By then we'd heard that it had been a WPC that had been killed. We didn't know who. And I was sat with my late wife watching the news. And Yvonne's picture flashed up on the screen. Now, I'm sure you imagine you could have cut the atmosphere in that room with a knife when that happened. And we didn't have mobile phones or anything like that in those days. So lots of phone calls were made that evening between my ex-wife and her friends, and eventually, I think 10 days later, she went to the funeral, but I didn't. I wasn't allowed to, because the miners' strike was on at the time. I don't know if you recall, but the miners' strike was on, and there was a lot of police requirement for things, and I couldn't be spared. So again, fast forward to 1992. By this time, I'm an inspector. I've been promoted, been a sergeant for a while, and I'm an inspector working at a place called Stoke Newington in North London, which is a really, really, really busy police station. At the time, Stoke Newington was the area of the greatest social and urban deprivation in the whole of the UK and the highest crime rate. It was an area of just 2.5 square miles, but it was so busy. And many times we were at work and you didn't know if you were coming or going. You were so busy because you're running around all the time dealing with things. So it was a very exciting place to work. Now, I was on duty one evening, and as one of my roles as the duty inspector was to carry out the initial investigation of crime scenes and to make an assessment as to whether the CID were going to be called in. I was sent with some of my uniformed colleagues to a situation where a young lady had been at a rooftop party, 4th or 5th floor of a house. It was a flat roof with a parapet wall. She'd sat on the parapet wall and fallen off, and she landed in the street outside. When I arrived, she was being worked on by paramedics, but she didn't survive. I went up to the roof to begin the initial investigation. I went to the parapet wall, I looked over into the street, and when I looked over into the street, I saw Yvonne Fletcher being worked on the ground in St James's Square, as clear as day. That was my first experience of a flashback. Not had one before. It was the initial symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Eventually culminated in me having a massive heart attack, or so I thought, on my way home from work one day. I was only 39 or 40, had all the symptoms. Turned out when I eventually got seen by the doctors that what had actually happened is I'd had a serious anxiety attack, which, as I subsequently discovered, mimics the symptoms of a heart attack. But for me, that was the beginning of a period of treatment, because my GP clearly recognised what was wrong with me and suggested I took a couple of weeks off work. I think he knew that it was going to take a little bit longer than that. He referred me for counselling. The counsellor got me to take antidepressants, which were very effective, I would add. And we started a series of verbal talking through counselling sessions. It didn't work very well because I would become overwhelmed by emotions when she asked me to talk about my symptoms, about my experiences, that kind of thing. And she suggested I should try writing therapy. And what she would do is she would send me away each week with a small question to sit down at home with a word processor, as we had in those days, and just write about how I was feeling, what was happening. And initially I was really quite poor at it. I struggled to find the words, but as the weeks and then the months rolled by, because I was off sick for quite some considerable time, much more than the 2 weeks that the GP had initially predicted, I started to get better at the writing. And one day she said to me, "Have you ever considered writing a book?" And I laughed. I said, "No, I never have. And I don't think I've got any intention of doing so either." Because what she was talking about was the idea of writing some form of autobiography to educate others about PTSD and the symptoms and the effects it has on you and that kind of thing. And I said, I don't think it would be worth it, because I said, I don't think anybody would be interested in reading the life story of an inspector from Stoke Newington with PTSD. I said, the best I could hope for, it would be sat on the shelves of some university somewhere, gathering dust for the occasional academic to pick it up and say, "Oh, that's interesting, I'll include that in my research." Not going to happen. Couldn't see the point, didn't want to do it. So I parked the idea and forgot about it. Anyway, I left the police. I was retired. God bless them, they gave me a pension after I was diagnosed fully. And I retired here to South Wales. My family are from South Wales. My mum's from Swansea, currently lives in Gilwyn. And so it was sort of a natural place to come to me, really, because it was like a second home, really. We used to holiday every year here, and it was a nice, comfortable place to get away from the environment that was London, that was triggering my PTSD problems. I started a boarding kennels, would you believe, just near the Blackwood area. And one day, unfortunately, for circumstances which had nothing to do with this conversation, I ended up getting divorced. And the business was taken over by my ex. I was sort of at a loss as to what I was going to do. And my brother, of all people, said to me, "Why don't you write that book that counsellor was persuading you to do? You've got time on your hands now. You haven't got any plans about what you're going to do with your future. It's too early to retire, really. Why don't you have a go at it?" And I thought about it. I thought, well, I'm still of a mind that nobody would read it. So he said, "Well, why don't you set your story to fiction? Why don't you, embellish it a bit, polish it up a bit, weave it into a story of fiction?" So I thought, okay, how hard can it be? I'll have a go. So I sat down one day at my computer and started to write. And I eventually finished the book. I pitched it in a very amateurish way to a couple of literary agents and to a couple of publishers. And those that bothered to reply, and not many did, weren't filled with enthusiasm. So again, my brother came to my rescue and he said, "Why don't you self-publish it? Use the new Amazon." It was new, the new Amazon Kindle direct publishing system that had just been created in those days. This was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And so I did that. I found that the mechanics of doing so weren't terribly challenging. I squirted it up onto Amazon. People started downloading it. And it started to pick up some quite nice reviews and was bringing me in some nice pocket money. And I was perfectly happy. I'd written my book and there I was. But then a very strange set of circumstances happened, because a chap called Anthony Lovelace was in Afghanistan working, writing a book called Sweating the Metal, which I'll give Anthony a plug because he did me a real favour. It is a very good book. And it's about a Chinook pilot called Frenchie Duncan, who won the Distinguished Flying Cross. And Anthony was writing his story on his behalf. And Anthony walked past a loadmaster who was helping with loading this Chinook, a helicopter. And the loadmaster was sitting reading his Kindle. And Anthony, being a bit of a journalist, a bit of a writer, said, "Oh, you know, what are you reading?" And he said, "Oh, I'm reading this book called Wicked Game." Of course, Anthony had never heard of Wicked Game, and when he asked more from the Lodi about the book, he'd never heard of this guy called Matt Johnson. And the Lodi said to him, he said, "Well, he's a very interesting backstory. He was a policeman who was there when Yvonne Fletcher was killed, and he's used that inspiration to write the story." Now, it turned out that Anthony Lovelace was also a former policeman and had worked at the same police station as Yvonne Fletcher, West End Central. And so he came home to his home in Belfast, where he lived. He downloaded my book, read it, liked it, got in touch with his literary agent and said, "I think you should have a word with this guy." Next thing I know is I get an email out of the blue from Anthony Lovelace saying, "I've read your book, I really liked it, I've chatted to my literary agent about it, and he'd like to have a look at it, please. Are you interested?" Well, not too surprisingly, Matthew, I said yes.
Yes.
And away I went. I sent them the manuscript. 3 weeks later, I was on the train up to London to sign a contract with the agent. We spent some time working on it. He found me a number of different publishers, all of whom were interested in publishing it. I went up to London, had a series of interviews with them, found one particular lady who I really liked, who was running a new publishing company called Arenda. And I really liked her. So I thought, right, she's the one we're going to go with. I spent the next few months working with Arenda's editor. And he gave me a really, what I would call a fast track course in creative writing. Because he said, "To be honest with you, Matt," he said, "your writing is rather raw." He said, "It needs to be polished if we're going to prepare it for the commercial market." So he said, "You've got the bones of a really good story." He said, "You just need some guidance on how to tell it." And over the course of the next few months, I worked quite closely with him, and he turned me, I think, from a storyteller into a writer. And I was amazed at the difference in quality with the end result compared to the self-published version. Having seen the end result, I now know why the agents and publishers rejected my initial submission, because there was a huge difference. And that set the ground really for books 2 and 3, which is another story really.
No, I mean, I read Wicked Game on holiday this year, and it came across as so authentic, very gripping, and the characters felt so real. So although it had gone through the publisher sort of process, there was still very much, you felt like, a lot of the time you're in the room, you're on the street while all the things were happening. You mentioned that Stoke Newington, it's mentioned in the book. So I get the feeling that obviously it didn't happen sort of exactly as you wrote it, but there's lots of personal experience that you've drawn on there. So although you haven't written an autobiography, there's elements.
Yes, there's there's a lot of me in the book. The book is fiction. The story that's woven into the background of the series of events is fictional, but it's not all, but a lot of the individual scenes that happen through the book are based on real events. The shootings involving the police officers and the chases through the streets and things like that. They are based on things that I was either saw or was involved in. And so there's an incident, for example, where a particular policeman is killed in an explosion. Yeah, that's based on the Harrods bombing, because I know what happened at the Harrods bombings, and so I used the background of the Harrods bombing to recreate a different scenario.
It definitely felt it had greater impact, because having done a little reading about you as a person and what led to the books being written in the first place, that authenticity added extra weight to those situations in the book. So it was, as I said, thoroughly gripping. When you're not writing yourself, And you mentioned that you've, in times in your life, you've had times when you've been able to pick up lots of books and times when you haven't. But at the moment, when you're not writing yourself, what sort of books do you dip into? Do you have any favorite authors? Do you stay within a genre, or do you like to experiment?
I would say in the world of fiction, thrillers are my favorite. Spy thrillers, crime thrillers are sort of inevitably, that's what steered me in the direction of writing in that genre myself, because it was something that excited me, so it was easiest to motivate myself. Absolutely, I would say that my favorite writer is John le Carré, and not to name drop here, but I've got a place in Cornwall. John le Carré lives in Cornwall. John le Carré discovered that I have a place in Cornwall, and one day I got an unsolicited email from his PA inviting me to meet him. David Cornwell, his real name is David Cornwell. Would you like to come and meet David and Jane Cornwell and have tea with them?
Yes.
Honestly, Matthew, I thought it was a scam, but it wasn't. And I couldn't afford not to try it to see if it was just it wasn't. And one day, this was 3 or 4 years ago now, my wife and I were sat in John le Carré's home in Cornwall having Cornish cream tea with him and his wife.
Wow.
And when he went off to make tea, I got my wife to pinch me on the thigh just to make sure it was real. But it was a fascinating opportunity, because I'd written a book which had gone into the spy world and had talked about things that were happening within MI5. He picked up the book through one of his sons, heard about it, was curious about it, and wanted to know where I got my information from. And of course, when I said to him, well, I got it because I was doing it.
Yeah.
And one of my all-time favorite authors became, I wouldn't call him a friend, but certainly an acquaintance with whom I was on friendly terms, which was very nice. Because when we left that day, he took me up to his study, and I sat opposite the desk where John le Carré sits at his desk writing his manuscripts. Now he wrote freehand, and there, sitting in the waste paper basket next to his desk, was his rejected material, pages of handwritten story, just with one rip through it, sitting there in the bin. And I looked at this and I thought, one day that's going to be worth a lot of money. But I can't, and I didn't.
Temptation.
But I'd taken him my John le Carré books to ask him if he'd sign them, because he did. He was very generous. What he did was when he put them all back in the bag after he signed them for me, he slipped a copy of his latest book, which was called Legacy, in with them. So when I got home and opened up the bag, my proudly signed books, there was an extra one as a gift. And I contacted him to say, rang him up and I said, oh, this is just so generous. Thank you so much. I said, would it be nice to keep in touch? And he said, by all means, old boy, but not too often.
Diplomacy.
In other words, don't be a pest.
Yeah.
You know? Be a mate, but don't be a pest.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic.
So that was lovely. So he's absolutely, I mean, he mega brownie points. I used to like the Reacher novels as well.
Yeah.
Lee Child was was a real favorite. He is and remains a real favorite. I started to go off Reacher novels a little bit, because he's done so many now, and I thought personally, they were becoming a little bit samey, a little bit predictable. Which is why I was so excited when I heard that he's handing over the reins to Andrew Child, because I thought to myself, I wonder, and it has happened, that his brother has injected new life. Mm. So the stories have evolved now, and now it's the same character, but with a different storyteller with new ideas. Mm. And is back to the old Reacher. And so I've become a Reacher fan again.
It must be interesting.
That's my two favourites, is the Carrie and Child, definitely.
It must be interesting to have such a, almost like a child, isn't it? It is a character that you've, and then give it to someone else to take it on.
I had the honour of interviewing Lee and Andrew Child a few weeks ago for a literary festival, the Crime Comedy Literary Festival, and they were so modest about it, and Lee Child himself was great when I asked him about that very kind of thing, and he said, do you know my biggest worry is you'll do it a little bit better than me.
That's always everyone's worry, isn't it?
But that's nice. That's nice. Yeah. It wasn't. It wasn't worried. He had no concerns that Andrew wouldn't be able to do it good enough. His slight concern was that you'd do it even better, which was lovely. And we're talking about, Matthew. We're talking about the most successful crime thriller author in the whole of the world, and yet he was such a nice, modest, pleasant individual, and a real role model for us, his fellow authors, who are aspiring to that kind of level of success, if you will. But he whatever happens, whatever your career takes you, you have to remain grounded and approachable and reasonable, and he's a really good demonstration of how to do that.
It's been an interesting last 18 months. The idea of being approachable and keeping in contact with people has been a bit more challenging for all the reasons of the pandemic. As a writer, have you found it to have positives and negatives, or has it been an interesting experience? How have you felt writing during the last 18 months?
From a writing perspective, it hasn't resulted in a great deal of change, because a writer's life in the main is very solitary. You're at home, you're with your computer, you're with your imaginary friends, with your research material that you can get through the internet if you need to. And so you just plod on with your story. What's been frustrating, two things really for me. One is I've missed the interaction, the physical interaction with readers. When you go to festivals and literary events, library talks, WI talks, U3A talks, all of them were cancelled. Everything was put on. And so not only did you miss the earning potential of doing all these events, because it's not just a question of getting paid for turning up. You earn because your name gets spread. People buy your books, and inevitably the publisher earns from you, and then you get royalties. So all these events help feed into the income that you need as an author. But I also missed the opportunity to visit places that I was writing about, because when I write about a scene of a place, I will always go and visit it, because I think for me there is no substitute for actually getting into the environment that you are going to write about, because you will pick up things that you can't pick up through Googling it. You can get a picture of what the scene looks like, you can see photographs, you can see plans. To go and actually stand on a mountain, in a field, in a building, in a church that you're going to write about, you get the sights, sounds, smells, sensations and that far more deeply affects you. So that then when you're going to write about it, you can write about it with far greater authenticity than somebody who's just looked at a picture of it on the internet. And that was something I really did miss, and which slowed down the writing process, because you couldn't go into these places. I wanted to. The book I was working on at the time was set within the confines of a military barracks.
Mm.
So I wanted to go and do a visit to a military barracks. And I had a couple of visits set up, lined up, ready to go. One down in Devon and another over here in Chepstow. And they had to be postponed because you simply weren't allowed to. Eventually, last summer, when the lockdown was lifted for a while, I was able to, but it did, and it changed. I mean, I wrote the scenes in the barracks, but then when I went back, because I needed to keep the writing process going, but then when I went and did the actual visits, I thought, no, it's all wrong. I've got to change it. I've got the environment wrong. That only comes from that physical contact that you get from actually going and seeing the people, smelling, walking into a barracks. What do you smell?
Yeah.
You've not been there, you'd think, oh, you smell nothing. Well, no, you don't. Actually, you smell the cleaning chemicals.
Yeah.
And things like that.
Yeah, when it all comes alive. You've mentioned that you're writing, you've got a couple of projects in the pipeline. Are you able to tell us about what those projects are?
One of them is the fiction, the latest fiction I've just finished, which is with my agent at the moment, and fingers crossed he's pitching it to publishers as we speak. That is a fiction, but it's based upon the tragedies that occurred at an army training barracks called Deep Cut in Surrey in the late 1990s and 2000s. And as many authors do, if you're going to write about a subject, you look at a scenario or something in the news or something that's in current affairs or something like that, and you ask yourself the question, what if? The question I asked myself with the Deep Cut tragedies was, what if a former soldier come policeman had been assigned to investigate those and had actually uncovered some truths that weren't exposed by the civilian police who were doing it? Would the inquiry have taken a completely different direction? Now, so I decided with that premise that I was going to do so, and I set it in a fictional setting. And then, as I was writing, I was reminded that the expression for young recruits is crows. They're called crows, which used to stand during the First World War for can't read or write. So young recruits when they were coming into the British Army in the First World War, many of them couldn't read or write. So they were called crows because they couldn't read or write. But in latter days, it's become known as combat recruit of war, a crow. So young recruits were known as crows. Cwmbran, Valley of Crows. Mm. So I realised then, I thought, well, yeah, why shouldn't I set this novel in Wales and in Cwmbran at a place which is just outside Cwmbran, at a fictional military camp, which doesn't exist, and then create this fictional story in the Valley of Crows. So initially, the title was called Valley of Crows, but it evolved and it eventually became called Crow 27, because it's the story of a young recruit who dies in mysterious circumstances in this fictional base outside Cwmbran, and she is crow number 27 of her intake. So the book is about the inquiry into her death. It's a sort of a whodunit, a sort of a what done it, what happened, and it involves the character that I kept in my first three novels, who's an ex-special forces officer who's become a policeman and is now a detective inspector, and who is studying for his chief inspector promotion when he is sent on a very politically sensitive mission to look at the theft of some rifles from a base which had turned up in London. And he arrives at the base just as the inquest is finishing into a young woman locally who's shot herself. And as he starts to dig into these theft of rifles, he discovers the connection between their theft and her death, and inevitably takes himself on a course which is at loggerheads with the military hierarchy in the Ministry of Defence. And I will tell you no more.
Oh. I'm definitely reading it because I'm a Cumbrian boy myself, born and bred, so I should be very interested. It doesn't often pop up in fiction.
No,
so,
it doesn't. But it's not because I'm helping run this Crime Cymru organisation, which is a collective of Welsh crime writers, and we like to support Welsh crime writing, Welsh crime writers writing that is set in crime. And I thought, well, if I'm helping chair this organisation, I really ought to set the book that I'm currently working on in Wales. It's only right that I should do so. And I'm glad I did, because it's certainly my perception now that Welsh crime writing is on the up, and writing set on Wales is on the up. When you look at the likes of Hinterland, and you look at the likes of Keeping Faith, the Matthew Hall series, I think Welsh set drama is very much on the ascendancy. So I'm glad I did choose to do so. Yeah,
you mentioned Crime Cymru, and you had a major part in setting that up. This crime writing collective. You sort of touched on what it stands for and what its purpose is. Would you like to talk about the sorts of things you've already done as a collective, and where you plan to go next?
To take you back, Crime Cymru started a few years ago when Cardiff Library ran a crime and coffee event, and a few crime authors from across Wales were invited. And I met two authors there called Alice Hawkins and Rosie Claverton. Rosie's from Cardiff. Alice is from just slightly out further. She actually lives in the Forest of Dean now, but she's from Ceredigion originally. And Alice had this idea, this embryonic idea, that we really should have some form of mutually supporting organisation for Welsh and Welsh-based crime writers. Rosie and I agreed. Weren't quite sure how we were going to go about doing it. What shall we call this? We think it's a good idea. We came up with the name Crime Cymru. And gradually we started to grow this organisation. We used Facebook and other social media to try and promulgate the message, and we gradually have grown to a group of about 50 or 60 members now, which is really nice. About 3 years into our growth, at one of our AGMs, we talked about the idea of running a literature festival. Now, Wales has no crime fiction literature festivals. It has very few, even beyond very small, book festivals of any kind. It doesn't have a national book festival. Scotland has 2. England, I think, has 7. Northern Ireland has 2. The Republic of Ireland has several. Wales didn't have any. So we said, well, isn't it about time we did? And who else is going to organise it if we don't? So we set about the logistics and planning of a literature festival. And we started talking to people who organise other events, discovered just how hard it is. It is a massive logistical exercise. It really is. Decided that where we were going to set it. And whilst we, inevitably, because of the high population density, Cardiff cries out as the centre for attracting the best audiences. But then we thought, well, no, it's not fair on North Wales if we host something in Cardiff, because it makes it very difficult for people from North Wales to get to. So what we decided was we're going to go halfway up Wales. We're going to find a venue halfway up Wales. And inevitably, because Alice is from Ceredigion, she said, well, how about Aberystwyth? We went and had a look at Aberystwyth, checked out the accessibility in terms of transport for Aberystwyth. Perfect choice. And what we discovered is also the people and the local authority in Aberystwyth and Ceredigion Council as well, hugely supportive. So they've helped us get going. Then lockdown happened. Bush. Plans scuppered. No festival's going to take place. So what we decided then was that we would, it's rather than running a physical festival in our first year, we'd run an online festival. We got a company called Hacker in Aberystwyth to help us with the technology in doing it. And we put together some panels, very much like we're doing now, talking on Zoom, but being recorded and transmitted live on YouTube, which I didn't know could be done, or which can be done. And over the course, I think the festival went on for about 10 days. We had nearly 4,000 viewers, which was just incredible. And we got some fantastic audience participation because it was new, because it was Welsh, and because it was us putting it together ourselves. It got people interested, and it was talked about in the publishing press and through all the various book blogs and the libraries, and we got some great audiences. And the feedback we got afterwards was very, very supportive. Having put all that case together, we then went to the major events department of the Welsh Government and said to them, look, how would you feel about helping us finance a proper physical festival to run in Aberystwyth in 2022? And after some quite probing and difficult questions and some hoops to jump through and things like that, eventually they've now said yes. We have to raise quite a considerable sum of money ourselves. We're halfway to doing that already. And once that's raised, and there's every likelihood that it'll be raised quite soon, then the Welsh Government has said that they will fund the rest for us, which is absolutely fantastic. And it means the physical festival can go ahead. So Wales will have its first crime fiction literary festival. And we will have the likes of Andrew Child. We think Anne Cleves is going to be coming. So there's going to be some really big names there. And then, yeah, I'll be there. Oh, I'll be there. I won't. I'm going to be helping organising it. But would you believe that my daughter is getting married on the same weekend?
No. Oh, there's a conundrum.
So Dad has. Oh no, it's no competition. I'm going to the wedding.
Yeah.
That only happens once in a lifetime. Well, hopefully. So I'm going, but then I'll be there for the. So I'll miss the first 2 days of the festival and be there for the second 2 days. So I'll be there for part of it. So I'm really looking forward to it. Alice, I have to say, is an absolute demon of a driver in pushing this forward and getting it organised. I co-chair with Alice, but Alice Hawkins, please read her books. She writes historical fine fiction, and they are absolutely blooming fantastic. And she is a very highly motivated person and a great organiser. As I say, I'm her co-chair, but I'm very much in a subordinate role to that. She is the motivator, the pusher, the driver behind this festival. We wouldn't be doing it without her.
Oh,
so all credit where credit's due. It's a fantastic. I mean, we many of us other Welsh authors, we're acting in supportive roles to help her out, and we do as we're told.
I'm sure I appreciate the team.
I think all festivals need that kind of person as who's the driving force to get it done, and we're lucky to have Alice who's doing that for us. I mean, if you look at all the festivals around the UK, behind there somewhere is one person. Now we've had an amazing stroke of luck because through a set of fortuitous circumstances, I was put in touch with a lady called Lindy Cook. And it turned out that Lindy was one of the original, in fact, the original organizer of the Hay Festival. Oh. So we now have, as part of our organising group, Lindy Cook, the lady who organised Hay. And Lindy, of course, knows the organisation of literary festivals inside out. So many of the mistakes that we were going to make through the period of organising it, she's been able to say, no, don't do that. This is what you do. And has been able to put us right. So I think she's saved us an absolute fortune, both in monetary terms and in time terms as well, as to get this organised. And then so the beginning of May 2022, on the bank holiday weekend, we will be in Aberystwyth with our first Goyle Crime Cymru Festival.
Nice.
So fingers crossed.
Oh, fingers crossed. That sounds absolutely fantastic. I'm sure lots of people watching this.
It'll rain, of course. You know that, don't you?
No. Not in Aberystwyth. Never rains in Aberystwyth. It's a lovely
Well,
place.
there is a reason that Ceredigion is so beautifully green in colour.
Yeah.
It really is a beautiful, beautiful county.
It is.
But there's a reason, is that it's that lush.
I'm sure everyone will be keeping in touch with that, and say fingers crossed. Everything sounds like it's going really well, and hopefully everything will go well on the event itself. Where can we find out more about this? There is a website, isn't there, for Crime Cymru?
Yeah, there's two websites. There's a website which is, the first one is www.crime.cymru, no org or UK at the end of it, just crime.cymru. And the festival website is Goyle, GWYL, Goyle Crime Cymru Festival.co.uk. And there's lots of information on there. There's also links to all the YouTube videos, so you can look back historically and watch the events that ran in May of this year. That's right. That's the online festival that ran in May of this year, and they're fascinating in themselves, because it's a live YouTube transmission.
Yeah.
Of course, if you get a technical problem, it's live. And so we have a few smiles while we're doing it, but generally speaking, actually, it came across. I was for a bunch of amateurs. When you try and look at what you produced objectively, I was really quite surprised that we were able to produce something which looks quite slick and quite professional.
Yeah.
What you don't see, of course, is what was going on in the background, which is a classic example of the duck on the fast-flowing river. It might look very serene, but those feet are working very hard.
Underneath, yeah. No, I managed to catch a couple, and it looks very, it looks like a really good sessions, and it does look very professional. I think you did an excellent job, seeing as everything had to change quite quickly to pull that off. So I think you all need to give yourselves a big pat on the back. It's fantastic. It's been brilliant talking with you today, Matt. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Wish you all the best for your future projects, and we're all looking forward very much to next year and the Crime Cymru Festival. So pob good luck, and hopefully we'll catch you again soon.
It's been a pleasure, Matthew. Lovely talking to you.
Thank you.